The reading of my father's will lasted exactly 17 minutes. I know because I counted every second watching the grandfather clock in the corner of his study while my brothers divided an empire worth $20 million. My name is Michael Harris, though the Harris part has always come with an asterisk. I'm 28 years old, and I've spent every one of those years being reminded that I'm the son who shouldn't exist. My father, Edward Harris, built his real estate empire from nothing, or so the Forbes articles claimed. He died 5 days ago at his desk, his hand still gripping a pen, signing contracts until his heart gave out. The man worked himself to death, and somehow that seemed fitting. He'd lived his entire life in transaction mode, everything measured in profit and loss, including his children, especially me. Attorney Robert Miller sat across from us at the mahogany table, his weathered hands arranging documents with practiced precision. To my left sat my oldest brother Daniel, 35, already wearing our father's Rolex he'd claimed from the body. To my right, Andrew, 32, texting his wife about which property they'd move into first. And then there was me, the illegitimate son, the reminder of our father's one moment of weakness with his secretary 30 years ago. The Chicago properties, including the 2 penthouses on Michigan Avenue and the 3 commercial buildings in River North valued at $9 million, I leave to my son Daniel. Miller read, his monotone voice echoing in the wood-paneled room. Daniel smirked and poured himself another glass of father's 80-year-old bourbon. About time, the old man recognized who actually ran the Chicago operations, the Lake Geneva estate. The complete yacht collection, including the Celestial Dream, and all vehicles in the Oak Brook storage facility, valued at $8 million, I leave to my son Andrew. Andrew actually laughed out loud. The cars. Lauren is going to lose her mind. There's a 1965 Mustang in that collection worth $2 million alone. They continued dividing the empire like kids, sorting Halloween candy stock portfolios, Swiss accounts, art collections, even the corporate jet. Every few minutes, one of them would glance at me with barely concealed amusement, waiting for my name to be called. We all knew it was coming. The question was, how little would it be? Michael, Miller finally said, and both my brothers leaned forward like vultures sensing carrion. Miller reached into his briefcase and pulled out a single brown envelope, aged and slightly bent at the corners. My name was written across it in shaky handwriting that must have been my father's near the end. I leave this envelope to be opened in private, containing what he needs to know. The silence lasted maybe 3 seconds before Daniel exploded with laughter so hard he spilled his scotch. An envelope. He was choking on his own amusement. 2 years of trying to play family and Daddy left you a letter. Andrew was more composed, but his eyes sparkled with cruel satisfaction. Maybe it's a thank you card. Thanks for understanding your place, kid. Here's a hallmark moment for your troubles. Or directions to the nearest employment office, Daniel added, already pulling out his phone to text someone the hilarious news. God, wait until the board hears about this. The bastard got paper while we got the kingdom. Robert Miller handed me the envelope with something that might have been sympathy in his eyes. It weighed nothing. 28 years of trying to earn my place in this family, and it all came down to something that weighed less than a credit card bill. Gentlemen, Robert Miller continued ignoring the laughter. Your father insisted I read this final statement. He adjusted his glasses and read, "Blood may determine birthright, but character determines worth. I trust each of you will receive exactly what you deserve." My brothers were too drunk on victory to catch the strange wording. They were already arguing about who would get father's office at corporate headquarters. I slipped the envelope into my jacket pocket, stood up without a word, and walked toward the door. "Hey, Michael," Daniel called out. "If you need a job, I might have an opening in building maintenance. You'd have to work your way up from the basement, but hey, you're used to being beneath us, right?" I kept walking. Their laughter followed me through the marble foyer past the portraits of Harris men who'd never acknowledged me out into the October afternoon where my Ford 12-year-old sat between their Maseratis like a punchline to a joke nobody needed to tell. Inside that envelope was a bank account number and 11 words that would reveal 27 years of lies. But I didn't know that yet. All I knew was that I was done begging for scraps from their table. I sat in my car engine off, staring at that envelope with my name written in dying hands, and wondered what final insult my father had saved for last. I never belonged in the Harris family, and everyone made sure I knew it. From the moment I could understand words, I understood that I was different, lesser tolerated, but never truly accepted. My earliest memory is of Daniel, then 10 years old, explaining to his private school friends why I lived in their house. "That's Michael," he said, pointing at me playing alone in the corner. "Dad's mistake from his secretary. We keep him around because Dad feels guilty. My mother, Karen Blake, died when I was 3. A car accident on the Oak Brook Expressway, they told me. Single vehicle brake failure. Tragic, but simple. She'd been Edward's secretary for 5 years, and their affair had produced me the evidence of my father's single lapse in judgment. Edward's wife had already died of cancer 2 years before I was born. So when Karen died, Edward took me in. Not out of love, I learned later, but out of obligation. The Harris Mansion in Winnetka was 30 rooms of cold marble and impossible standards. While Daniel and Andrew had their names engraved on their bedroom doors, mine simply read, "Guest Room 3. At family dinners, I sat at the far end of the table, close enough to be present, but far enough to be forgotten. Edward would ask his sons about their days at Northwestern University, their internships at the company, their thoughts on market trends. To me, he'd occasionally nod and ask if I needed anything for school. "No, sir," was always my answer, even when I did. Andrew was subtler in his cruelty than Daniel, but more effective. Where Daniel used blunt force, Andrew used surgical precision. He'd invite me to join him and his friends, then spend the entire time explaining why I couldn't participate in their activities. "Michael can't come to the country club, guys. They have legitimate member requirements." Or my personal favorite. "Michael understands why he can't be in the family photos. It would confuse the investors. I learned to make myself useful to survive. When Daniel needed someone to write his college essays, I did it. When Andrew needed someone to take the blame for crashing the Mercedes, I took it. When Edward needed someone to work 18-hour days at the company without complaint or recognition, I was there. I became fluent in the language of servitude thinking. If I just worked hard enough, sacrificed enough, maybe one day Edward would look at me the way he looked at them. But he never did. At Harris Group board meetings, I was introduced as his ward or special project. At charity galas, I was the young man Edward mentored. Never son, never family. I watched him pose for pictures with Daniel and Andrew at company events while I held their coats off camera. I listened to him tell business associates about his 2 boys, while I stood 3 feet away invisible. The crazy part was that I outperformed both of them in every measurable way. While Daniel and Andrew partied through their Ivy League educations on legacy admissions and gentlemen's C's, I earned my way into the University of Chicago on merit scholarships. While they showed up to board meetings hungover and unprepared, I built my own consulting firm from nothing, landing 6-figure contracts by 26. My clients included Fortune 500 companies that would laugh Daniel out of the room, but none of it mattered. You can't make yourself legitimate through achievement. Edward told me once, the closest he ever came to acknowledging my situation, "You are what you are, Michael. Make peace with it." So I tried. I dated a woman named Emily for 2 years, never introducing her to my family, because how do you explain that you're both a Harris and not a Harris? I rented a small apartment in Lincoln Park, despite having theoretical access to multiple family properties. I built a life adjacent to but separate from the Harris empire, like a satellite that orbits but never lands. Then Edward started getting sick. The heart problems began last year, and despite the best doctors money could buy, we all knew time was running out. Daniel and Andrew circled like sharks, visiting more frequently, suddenly interested in their father's wisdom and stories. They spoke openly about their inheritance plans in front of me, debating which properties they'd keep and which they'd sell. "What do you think Michael will get?" I once heard Andrew's wife Lauren ask at a family dinner. "Whatever it is," Andrew replied, not bothering to lower his voice. "It'll be more than he deserves." The call about Edward's death came while I was reviewing contracts for a client. "Massive heart attack at his desk," the secretary said. He'd been found slumped over acquisition papers, pen still in hand. Somehow that detail made me sadder than the death itself. The man had died exactly as he'd lived alone with his work, measuring worth in square footage and profit margins. Standing in that study 5 days later, watching my brothers celebrate their windfall, I realized I'd spent my entire life trying to earn love from a man who didn't have any to give. Not to them, not to me, not even to himself. The will reading was scheduled for Friday afternoon at 2 Huzarug sharp. I arrived at the estate 15 minutes early, parking my Ford behind a catering truck that was unloading champagne. Daniel and Andrew had already started their celebration, apparently confident enough in their inheritance to hire party planners before the will was even read. I found them in the study with their wives, drinking Edward's prized bourbon collection and dividing up assets on cocktail napkins like kids trading baseball cards. Daniel's wife, Rachel, was on FaceTime with a real estate agent touring a penthouse in Paris. Lauren, Andrew's wife, had spread yacht catalogs across Edward's desk, circling upgrades for the boats she hadn't even inherited yet. "Look who decided to show up," Daniel announced when I walked in, raising his glass in mock salute. "Come to see how the real heirs inherit." "Just here for the reading," I said, taking a seat in the corner, the same chair I'd always occupied during family meetings. Smart to manage expectations. Andrew added, not looking up from his phone, where he was apparently already listing one of the properties he expected to inherit. "Though I'm curious what Dad came up with for you. My bet's on that broken Rolex he never fixed. Seems poetic, giving the broken son the broken watch." Attorney Robert Miller entered at exactly 200, his presence immediately shifting the room's energy from casual cruelty to formal proceeding. He'd been Edward's lawyer for 30 years, had built the entire legal structure of Harris Group. If anyone knew Edward's secrets, it was Miller. "Gentlemen, ladies," he nodded to the wives, "shall we begin?" He opened his leather briefcase with practiced efficiency, removing a thick folder marked with Edward's seal. The will itself was surprisingly brief for such a massive estate, but then Edward had always been economical with words. The last will and testament of Edward James Harris, executed 3 months prior to his death, superseding all previous documents. Miller began, his voice carrying the weight of legal finality. The first 10 minutes went exactly as everyone expected. Daniel inherited the Chicago real estate portfolio, $9 million of prime properties, including the buildings that generated nearly $1 million in monthly rental income. He actually whooped when Miller read the addresses, already calculating expansion possibilities. Andrew received the Lake Geneva estate, where we'd spent summers, the complete yacht collection that included 3 boats worth over $1 million each, and Edward's entire vehicle collection, including vintage cars that belonged in museums. $8 million in toys for a man who'd never worked an honest day in his life. They split the liquid assets, the stock portfolios, the offshore accounts Edward thought nobody knew about. Each brother walked away with additional millions in investments and cash. Rachel was already texting her friends, planning a celebration party at the Met. Lauren had pulled up the yacht club website, registering for slip spaces and cons. "Michael," Miller finally read, and the room went silent with anticipation. He reached into his briefcase again, this time pulling out a single brown envelope, aged and bent at the corners like it had been handled many times. My name was written across it in Edward's handwriting, but shaky like he'd written it while his hands were already failing. "I leave this envelope to be opened in private, containing what he needs to know. The laughter was immediate and explosive. Daniel actually fell back in his chair, spilling scotch across Edward's Persian rug. Andrew was more controlled, but his smirk said everything. An envelope. Daniel wheezed between laughs. 2 years of ass-kissing for a piece of paper. Maybe it's a coupon, Rachel suggested, getting in on the joke. 10% off your next therapy session for daddy issues. Or directions to the nearest homeless shelter, Lauren added, since he won't be living in the guest house anymore. Robert Miller handed me the envelope without meeting my eyes. It felt impossibly light, like holding air. 28 years in this family and my entire inheritance weighed less than a birthday card. Gentlemen, there's one additional matter, Miller continued, his voice cutting through their laughter. Your father insisted I read this statement. He adjusted his glasses and read from a separate paper. Blood may determine birthright, but character determines worth. I trust each of you will receive exactly what you deserve. Sanctimonious to the end, Daniel muttered, already pouring another drink. At least we deserve millions while Michael deserves stationery. They were too drunk on victory to notice Miller's expression when he read those words, the way his eyes lingered on them like they knew something we didn't. They were too busy planning their new lives to wonder why Edward had insisted that a specific phrase be read aloud. I stood to leave the envelope burning in my pocket. Andrew called out as I reached the door. Hey Michael, when you open that, let us know if it's at least good paper. Maybe you can frame it, hang it in whatever studio apartment you end up in. Their laughter followed me out of the house, past the catering staff setting up for their celebration, past the portraits of Harris patriarchs who would never claim me out into the October afternoon where my Ford waited like the only honest thing in my life. I sat in my car for an hour, engine off, staring at that envelope like it might explode. Part of me wanted to tear it up without opening it, preserve what little dignity I had left by refusing to participate in Edward's final humiliation. But curiosity is stronger than pride, especially when you've spent your whole life searching for answers. The parking lot had emptied except for the catering trucks. Through the estate's windows, I could see the party beginning, shadows of my brothers and their friends toasting to their good fortune. I turned the envelope over in my hands, feeling the quality of the paper. It was old, maybe decades old, the kind of heavy stock nobody used anymore. Finally, I opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper folded once. The message was handwritten in Edward's careful script, but steadier than the writing on the envelope, like this had been written years ago when his hands were still strong. Michael, this is for the child who was never supposed to exist. Account number 44, 478291163, Geneva Trust Bank. Your mother knew why. That was it. No explanation, no fatherly wisdom, no apology. Just a Swiss bank account number and a reference to my dead mother. I read it 5 times, trying to extract meaning from those few words. The child who was never supposed to exist. Even in his final message to me, Edward couldn't resist reminding me I was a mistake. I drove home to my apartment in Lincoln Park, my mind racing through possibilities. Maybe it was a small trust fund, enough to show he'd thought of me, but not enough to matter. Maybe it was symbolic, $100 to match the 100 ways he'd denied me. Or maybe it was nothing. A closed account. One final joke from beyond the grave. My laptop was open on my kitchen table where I'd left it that morning, working on a client presentation I'd never finish. I navigated to Geneva Trust Bank's website. Their discreet logo promising the Swiss banking privacy that had hidden fortunes for centuries. The login process was simpler than expected, the account number, my social security number, and a security question, mother's maiden name. Blake, Karen Blake, the secretary who'd made the mistake of falling for her boss. Before I could check the balance, before I could learn what Edward's final insult would be, I stopped. There was something else in his message that bothered me. Your mother knew why. I'd never really investigated my mother's death. Why would I? It was a car accident when I was 3. Tragic but simple. But Edward's words suggested there was something more, something my mother had known. I minimized the banking website and pulled up the Illinois State Accident Database. It took some searching, but I found it. October 15th, 2001. Karen Blake, single vehicle accident, Oak Brook Expressway. The basic report was what I'd always been told. Brake failure. Car went off the road, fatal on impact. But there was a detailed investigation file attached, something I'd never known existed. I downloaded it, my hands starting to shake as I read the investigating officer's notes. Brake line appears to have been deliberately severed. Tool marks consistent with purposeful damage. Recommendation for homicide investigation. Note: investigation terminated at family's request. See attached authorization. The authorization was signed by Edward Harris. My father had stopped the investigation into my mother's murder. I called Robert Miller. My fingers fumbling with the phone. He answered on the first ring like he'd been waiting. Michael. His voice was careful, measured. I assume you've opened it. What the hell is this, Robert Miller? What did Edward know about my mother's death? There was a long pause. I could hear him breathing, choosing his words. I can only tell you what Edward authorized me to say. Check the account first, then you'll understand why your mother died. The truth has been waiting for 27 years. Tell me now, I demanded, but the line was already dead. I sat back in my chair, staring at the computer screen. The accident report was still open in one tab, the bank website in another. My mother had been murdered. Edward knew it. And somehow, there was a Geneva Trust bank account that would explain everything. I clicked back to the banking website, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The account dashboard loaded slowly, each second stretching like an hour. When the balance finally appeared, I had to blink several times to make sure I was seeing the numbers correctly. This wasn't possible. This had to be an error. I refreshed the page once, twice, 3 times, but the number remained the same. The phone rang, interrupting my shock. Unknown international number. Mr. Michael. The voice was elderly, German-accented formal. My name is Thomas Keller. I've been waiting 27 years for you to access this account. I believe it's time you learned the truth about your mother, your father, and the $20 million your brothers just inherited. I looked back at the screen, at the impossible number staring back at me, and realized my entire life had been built on a lie that was about to unravel. I'm listening, I said. The number on my laptop screen didn't make sense. I refreshed the page 3 times, certain there was some error, some misplaced decimal point that would bring this back to reality. But the balance remained unchanged, $140 million. Mr. Michael, are you still there? Thomas Keller's voice pulled me back from my shock. This can't be real, I managed to say, gripping the phone like it might disappear. There is no mistake, Keller replied, his German accent giving each word careful weight. This account has been growing for 30 years, waiting for this moment. But the money, Keller continued, was just the beginning of what I needed to understand. I clicked on the account history, scrolling through decades of deposits. They started in 1995, 3 years before I was born, regular transfers from something called Project Prometheus, government serial numbers, federal routing codes. The final deposit was made October 15th, 2001, the day my mother died. Your mother, Mr. Michael, was not who you believed her to be, Thomas Keller continued. Karen Blake was not simply a secretary. She was Senior Special Agent Karen Blake, FBI Financial Crimes Division. She was embedded in Harris Group as part of a 3-year investigation into your father's money laundering operation. The room started spinning. I had to put my head between my knees to keep from passing out. That's impossible. She was just his secretary. They had an affair. The affair was real, Keller said gently. That was the problem. Agent Blake fell in love with her target. You were never supposed to happen. When she became pregnant, she tried to extract herself from the operation. She wanted to come clean to Edward to find a way out that would protect both of you. But Edward found out. First, I said the pieces clicking together in my mind. Yes, he discovered her true identity when you were 2 years old. But by then, something unexpected had happened. Edward had fallen in love with her too. And despite everything, he loved you. The boy who was never supposed to exist had become the only genuine thing in his world of calculated transactions. I thought about all those years of cold distance, the refusal to call me son, the constant reminders that I didn't belong. If he loved me, he had a funny way of showing it. He kept you at a distance to protect you. Mr. Michael, your brothers Daniel and Andrew were already being groomed to take over the criminal enterprise. They were 13 and 10 when your mother died. Old enough to be dangerous if they knew the truth. If they discovered that you were the son of an FBI agent, that your existence threatened everything they stood to inherit. What do you think would have happened? The murder of my mother suddenly made sense. They killed her, I whispered. Not personally, but yes. When Daniel learned about your mother's true identity, he told Andrew. Together, they hired someone to cut her brake lines. They were children, but they were Harris children raised to see threats and eliminate them. Edward discovered what they'd done after it was too late. And he covered it up, I said, anger rising in my throat. He made a choice. Turn in his sons for murder or protect the only innocent person in the entire equation, you. So he made a deal with the FBI. Your mother had compiled 3 years of evidence before her death. Everything needed to destroy the Harris empire. Edward would continue to run the operation, feeding information to the Bureau, helping them catch bigger fish. In exchange, they would let the empire stand until his death, ensuring you grew up protected, if not loved, and the money. Your mother had already started converting evidence to assets preparing to run with you. She liquidated intelligence, sold information to competitors, moved money through channels that would take decades to trace. It was her insurance policy. When she died, Edward continued the work, adding to it every year. Every crime your brothers committed, every dollar they stole, he matched it in your account. The blood money they're inheriting today is built on the same foundation as your fortune. The difference is, yours is clean. I stood up, pacing my small apartment, trying to process 28 years of lies unraveling in minutes. There's more, Thomas Keller said. Check your secure messages in the account. I clicked the message tab. Hundreds of files appeared, financial records, photographs, recorded conversations. Evidence of every crime committed by Harris Group over 3 decades. But the most recent files were different. They were dated from the last 5 years, all focused on Daniel and Andrew. Your brothers weren't just inheriting wealth today, Mr. Michael. They were inheriting the criminal empire, and they'd been expanding it enthusiastically, adding murder, extortion, and human trafficking to the family business. Your father documented everything. He wanted you to have the choice he never gave himself. You can walk away with your fortune, or you can deliver justice. The evidence is all there, admissible, incontrovertible. I stared at the files, understanding finally what Edward's last words meant. Character determines worth. He hadn't been mocking me. He'd been passing judgment on all of us. I sat with that power for 3 days. $140 million and enough evidence to destroy everything my brothers had just celebrated inheriting. The rational part of me said to take the money and disappear, build a new life far from the Harris legacy of blood and lies. But I kept thinking about my mother dying alone on that highway, and the 13-year-old boy who ordered her death now drinking champagne in a Chicago penthouse. On the 4th day, I made my decision. I transferred $12 million to a new account, enough to build the life I wanted, but not enough to lose myself in wealth I hadn't earned. The rest would stay where it was growing, waiting a monument to my mother's sacrifice that I didn't need to claim. Then I created 2 packages. The first went to the FBI, containing every file from the account, every document my father had gathered, every crime my brothers had committed in their eagerness to expand the empire. The second package went to Robert Miller with specific instructions. Deliver it to my brothers at exactly 2:00 p.m. on Tuesday, the same time they'd laughed at my envelope. I booked a flight to Geneva for Monday night one way. The arrests happened Tuesday afternoon. I watched from my hotel room in Austria as NBC News broke the story. Federal agents swarming Harris Group headquarters. Daniel led out in handcuffs, his face a mask of confusion and rage. Andrew, trying to run, tackled in the parking garage he'd just inherited. The news called it the largest financial crime bust in Chicago history. 3 decades of money laundering, extortion, and murder unraveling in a single afternoon. My package to them contained a single sheet of paper, the same aged stationery Edward had used for my envelope. The message was brief. Character determines worth. Enjoy what you deserve. The child who was never supposed to exist. Within hours, every asset was frozen. The properties, the yachts, the cars all seized by federal authorities. Rachel was caught trying to flee to Paris with suitcases full of jewelry. Lauren was arrested at the yacht club, still trying to register boats she no longer owned. The empire built on blood money collapsed entirely, taking everyone who touched it down except for one person. Me. I changed my name after that, became someone new in a country that understood reinvention. The $12 million I'd taken was more than enough to build something real. I started a foundation for children who'd lost parents to violence, kids who knew what it meant to be collateral damage in someone else's war. We've helped 350 families so far, giving them what I never had. Someone who saw their pain and said it mattered. Thomas Keller still manages the main account. It's grown to over $220 million now through investments. A fortune that doubles every decade. He calls once a year on the anniversary of my mother's death, always with the same question. Will you claim it this year, Mr. Michael? And I always give the same answer. The child who was never supposed to exist is doing just fine without it, because that's what I finally understood. Sitting in that Vienna hotel room watching my brothers' lives crumble on international television. Edward had given them exactly what they'd always wanted, the Harris Empire. Every poisoned dollar of it. And he'd given me what I'd never known I needed, freedom from it all. My mother died trying to save me from that life. Edward lived keeping me at arm's length to protect me from it. Every cold shoulder, every public denial, every reminder that I didn't belong. It wasn't rejection. It was preservation. He made me strong enough to survive without his love, because he knew one day I'd have to survive without his protection. The real inheritance wasn't the money or the evidence or even the truth. It was the chance to choose who I wanted to be when everything I'd thought defined me was stripped away. Daniel and Andrew never had that chance. They were born into the empire, raised to run it, and ultimately destroyed by it. But I was the child who was never supposed to exist, which meant I was free to exist however I chose. Sometimes I walk past banks in Geneva and think about those millions sitting there growing like some golden tumor. Sometimes I wonder what my life would look like if I claimed it all. Then I remember my mother dying to keep me from that money source and Edward living in cold distance to keep me from its corruption. And I keep walking because some inheritances are too heavy to carry. Some fortunes cost more than they're worth. And sometimes the greatest wealth is discovering that you already have enough. That's the truth about being the child who wasn't supposed to exist. Once you accept it, you're free to exist entirely on your own terms. If this story resonated with you, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear that their worth isn't determined by others' recognition. Comment below with your thoughts on Michael's choice. Would you have taken all the money or walked away like he did? And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories about family, truth, and the choices that define us. Thank you for watching, and remember, your real inheritance is the freedom to choose who you become.